My name is Sadie, and for 26 years my parents told me I was adopted. I built my entire self around that one word. It explained everything why I never quite fit. Why my father could never quite look at me the way he looked at my sister. Why I always felt like a guest in my own family who'd simply stayed too long. Adopted, I wore it like a coat I was never allowed to take off, even indoors, even in summer. It was the first thing I knew about myself, and the lens I saw everything else through. Every cold look, every left-out moment, every time I felt like the odd one in the family photo, I had a word that explained it. And the word was adopted, and I never once thought to question it, because who questions the most basic fact of their own life? And then, at 26, pregnant with my first child, and sitting in a doctor's office that wanted a family medical history I didn't have, I did the most ordinary thing in the world. I spit in a little tube and mailed off a DNA test. Because I wanted to know what I might be passing on to my baby. I wanted, for once in my life, to know where I came from. 6 weeks later, the results came. And I want you to understand, I opened that email expecting a list of strangers. I expected to finally meet, on a screen, the blurry outline of the family that had given me up. Instead, the very first name on my match list, flagged in bold as a close blood relative, was my own grandmother, the grandmother who'd raised me, the woman who told me I was adopted. I wasn't adopted. I had never been adopted. And the truth my family had buried under that word for 26 years was so much crueler than any of us were ready for, and before it was over, that one little tube of spit had torn through 3 different families, including 2 I didn't even know I had. Welcome to Composed Drama Stories, where the women everyone underestimated finally tell their side. If quiet strength and slow justice are your kind of evening, stay with me. Before I'm done, I'm going to take you into the room where I made my mother tell me the truth, 26 years too late. I'm going to introduce you to a dead man I grieved without ever meeting, and a sister I gained the same week I lost my whole childhood. But to understand what that NA test detonated, you first have to understand what it was like to grow up as the adopted one in a house with a real daughter. Let me take you back. I grew up outside Pittsburgh, in a tidy brick house on a tidy street, with 2 parents and a little sister named Bree. And from my earliest memory, I knew there were 2 kinds of children in that house. There was Bree, who belonged, and there was me, who'd been let in. My mother, Carol, told me the adoption story so early and so often that I can't remember learning it. It was just always true. The way the sky is up. She'd tell it gently, with a sad little smile. We chose you, Sadie. Most parents just get whatever baby comes along. But we picked you out special. It was supposed to make me feel wanted. It made me feel like a purchase. Something selected, and therefore something that could be returned. And there was always a softness in how she said it that I mistook. For years. For love, I understand now that it was guilt, the particular tenderness of a person petting the very thing they're standing on. She had answers for everything, my mother. When I asked, the way kids do, who my real parents were, she'd get teary and tell me the records were sealed, that they were young people who just couldn't keep me, that it was kindest not to go digging in the past. She steered me away from it so gently and so consistently that I learned, without ever being told outright, that wondering about where I came from was a kind of ingratitude, a betrayal of the good people who'd taken me in. She built the walls of that lie out of love-shaped bricks, and I helped her lay them, because I was a child, and I trusted my mother the way children do. completely, with no door left open behind me. And my father, the man I called Dad, Glenn never even pretended. I need you to understand the particular chill of being a child and knowing, in your bones, before you have the words for it, that one of your parents is just enduring you. Glenn didn't hit me. He didn't scream. He did something quieter, and worse, he was simply absent in my direction. He came alive for Bree. He'd swing her up, help with her homework, call her kiddo, show up at her recitals with flowers. And then he'd turn to me, and something behind his eyes would close like a shop at the end of the day. "That's nice, Sadie," he'd say, already looking away. I spent my whole childhood performing for a man whose love was always sold out by the time I got to the front of the line. I have 100 small memories, and they all have the same shape. The time I made the honor roll in 5th grade and ran home with the certificate, and Glenn glanced at it and said, "Good, good," and went back to his paper, and 20 minutes later, Bree showed him a drawing of a horse, and he put it on the refrigerator and kept it there for a year. The father-daughter dance in middle school that he had to work through, and then I saw photos of him at Bree's 2 years later, in a tie, beaming, the way he'd put his hand on the back of Bree's neck when we walked. This casual, easy ownership. This "she's mine," and how he never once in my life did that to me. I used to lie in bed and catalog the differences like evidence in a case I was building against myself, because the only conclusion I could reach was that there was something wrong with me. Something unlovable. Some flaw so deep that even a man who'd chosen to take me in couldn't warm to me. I told myself it was because I was adopted. Of course Glenn loved Bree more Bree was his. I wasn't. I made 1,000 little excuses for him. The way kids do. Because it's less terrifying to believe your father has a reason than to believe he just doesn't love you. I worked so hard. I got the good grades. I never made trouble. I was the easy one, the helpful one, the grateful one, always so careful to be grateful. Because adopted kids are supposed to be grateful, aren't they? I learned to read Glenn's moods the way you'd read weather before a storm. To make myself small and useful and pleasant. To never ever give him a reason to wish he hadn't kept me. I was auditioning every single day for a part I'd already been told I couldn't have. The part of a real daughter. And Bree, my sister, grew up watching all of this, learning the lesson the house was teaching. That she was the real one, and I was the runner-up. She wasn't cruel about it. Not exactly. She just believed it, the way you believe anything you're taught young enough. She'd say things like, "Well, you don't have Dad's temper because you're not actually related." Tossing it off like it was nothing. Like it didn't land in me like a stone. When we fought as kids, she had the ultimate weapon. And she used it without even understanding it was a weapon. At least, I'm really theirs. There was always an asterisk next to me in that family. Always a little footnote that said, "Not really one of us." I was in every holiday, every report card, every photo on the stairs, and somehow in none of them. The way a guest ends up in the background of your vacation pictures. Present, but not belonging. Pictured, but not counted. By the time I was grown, I had made a kind of peace with it, the brittle kind of peace you make with a thing you've decided you can't change. I moved out at 18 and didn't look back hard. I became a paramedic, and it turns out I'm good in a crisis, which makes a grim kind of sense when your whole childhood was a slow-motion emergency you learned to stay calm inside of. While everyone around me panicked, I'd go still and clear and capable because I'd been training for it at the dinner table my entire life. I built something real. I married a good man named Eli, who loved me plainly and completely and without an asterisk. The very first person who ever did. who used to get genuinely angry on my behalf when I'd mention, casually, the way Glenn treated me. Because to Eli, it wasn't casual at all. And then I got pregnant, and I was happier than I had ever been in my life. And also quietly, secretly terrified, because I was about to have the one thing I had never had. A blood relative, a person who would actually, biologically, finally be mine. I remember pressing my hand to my belly at night and thinking, you'll be the first one. The first person in the whole world who's really, truly related to me. And that not anger, not suspicion, just love is the thing that sent me looking. It was a Tuesday afternoon at a prenatal appointment, and a kind nurse with a clipboard was running through the family medical history. Heart disease? Cancer? Diabetes? Any genetic conditions? And I gave the answer I'd given my whole life. The answer that had always made me feel like a person with no roots. I don't know. I'm adopted. Except this time it wasn't just about me. This time there was a baby who deserved a history. A real one. And I was going to have to hand her the same shrug my parents had handed me. I was so tired of not knowing. I wanted to give my child the thing I'd never had. So when my cousin Mara, who'd done one of those ancestry kits and wouldn't stop talking about our family's roots, all excited, telling me I had to test too, kept pushing, I finally said yes. To find my birth family. For my baby's sake. I had no idea I was lighting a fuse that had been waiting 26 years to burn. The results came on an ordinary Tuesday. I remember exactly where I was. I was on shift, on my lunch break, sitting on the back bumper of the rig in the ambulance bay with a sandwich I never finished. My phone buzzed with the email, and my heart did a little leap. Because this was the moment I'd waited my whole life for. I was finally going to see them. The strangers I came from. The young couple who couldn't keep me. I opened it with shaking hands, ready to meet the ghosts that had haunted every mirror I'd ever looked into. Instead, the screen showed me my matches, ranked by how closely we shared Dina, strongest at the top. And at the very top, where it said in clean letters closest relatives, were names I knew. My cousin Mara, the one who'd talked me into testing in the first place, listed as a first cousin. A blood first cousin. My grandmother Jean, who'd done one of these kits 2 years back for fun, listed plainly as my grandmother, that unmistakable, can't fake it, half the Dina, in common biological grandmother. My Aunt Sharon. 2 more cousins I'd grown up with at every Thanksgiving. The entire maternal side of the family that raised me, the family that had told me to my face I wasn't related to them, lighting up the top of my screen as my actual, literal, undeniable blood. I stared at it. I refreshed the page like an idiot, as if the truth might reload into something gentler. It didn't. The names just sat there, glowing, rearranging my entire existence, one line at a time. I sat in that ambulance bay, and I could not breathe. Because here is the simple, brutal math of it, and you don't need to be a scientist to follow it. An adopted child does not share DNA with the family that adopted her. That's what adopted means. If my grandmother was my biological grandmother, if Mara was my biological cousin, then my mother, Carol, was my biological mother. I was not adopted. I had never been adopted. I was Carol's own flesh and blood, and she had looked at me across the dinner table for 26 years and told me I was a stranger she'd taken in. I read it again and again. I clicked into the relationship details, the way you press on a bruise to make sure it's real. Shared Dina, the exact amount a grandmother and granddaughter share. the exact amount a first cousin shares. The site doesn't guess at numbers like that. The site was telling me in cold blue text that everything I had ever been told about myself was a fabrication. My partner found me out there 20 minutes later, still sitting on the bumper of the rig, phone in my hand, and he asked if I'd gotten a bad call. And I almost laughed, because yes, I had. The worst call of my life. And it was about me. I'm a paramedic. I have walked into the worst moments of strangers' lives and kept my hands steady, kept my voice calm, held the line while everything fell apart. And I sat in that bay and shook. Because there is no protocol for finding out your own mother is a liar and your whole self is a cover story. I want to tell you what that does to you, sitting there in your work uniform with your entire life rearranging itself. It wasn't relief, even though some small, starved part of me had always dreamed of being really theirs. It was something closer to horror. Because if I wasn't adopted, then the adoption story wasn't a kindness. It was a lie, a deliberate, decades-long, look you in the eye lie. And you do not tell a child a lie that big, for that long, by accident. You tell it because the truth is something you are absolutely desperate to hide. Which meant there was a truth under there, something so bad they'd spent my whole life burying it. And I was going to find it. So I went looking for the truth. And this is the part where I stopped being the confused girl staring at her phone and started being the woman who was going to get to the bottom of her own life, no matter what it cost. I want to be honest about that choice. Because it was a choice. And it wasn't an easy one. There's a path where you find out something like this, and you bury it. Where you decide the life you have, however cold, is less frightening than the truth, and you close the laptop and you never speak of it again. I understand people who take that path, but I couldn't. Partly because I'm built to run toward the emergency instead of away from it. That's the job. And somewhere along the way, it became the person. And partly because of the baby. I was about to bring a new person into the world, and I could not stand the idea of handing her a heritage made of fog and lies the way mine had been handed to me. She deserved to know who she was, which meant I had to find out who I was. There was no version of protecting her that didn't run straight through the truth. So I didn't look away. I leaned in. I started pulling the thread, fully aware it might unravel everything, and ready, for the first time in my life, to let it. Because the screen wasn't done with me. Below all my known relatives, below my grandmother and my cousins and my aunt there, was a second cluster of close matches. A whole branch of people I had never heard of in my life. A dozen names I'd never seen. All clustered together the way a family clusters. And at the very top of that unknown branch, flagged in bold, was a name, Gia Russo. Predicted relationship, half-sister. Half-sister. I wasn't adopted, my own family proved that, and yet here was a half-sister from a family I'd never heard of. I sat there and made my hands stop shaking, and forced myself to think it through. The way I'd think through a patient with symptoms that don't add up. If Carol was my biological mother, and I had a half-sister from a completely unknown family, then the shared parent between me and this Gia Russo couldn't be Carol. It had to be my father. My biological father. Which meant the man who raised me, Glenn, the man who could never quite love me, was not my biological father at all. And these Russos, this whole unknown branch lighting up my phone, were his people. My people. And the second I understood that, Glenn's entire cold, closed-off life rearranged itself into a terrible new picture. He hadn't held his love back from me because I was adopted. He'd held it back because I was living, breathing, gap-toothed proof that his wife had been with another man. Every time Glenn looked at me across that kitchen, he wasn't seeing a stranger's child he'd kindly taken in. He was seeing the affair. He was seeing the worst day of his marriage, wearing a little girl's face, asking him to come to her recital. I wasn't his daughter to him. I was the evidence. And they had dressed that evidence up in the soft, respectable word adopted, so that no one, not the neighbors, not the family, not the child herself, would ever sit down and do the math. I didn't go to my mother first. I want you to know that, because it matters, and because it's the moment I took the wheel of my own life. I didn't storm into that brick house demanding answers, because I had spent 26 years getting nothing but lies from those people, and I was not going to drive over there and collect one more. If I'd given Carol the first move, she'd have had a story ready before I finished my sentence. She always did. No, I was going to walk in already knowing the truth, so that this time, for the first time, I'd be the one holding it. So I did the active thing, the harder thing, the thing that scared me. At 2 a.m, while my husband Eli slept beside me, I messaged Gia Russo myself, a total stranger. The half-sister my screen had handed me. I'll never forget what I wrote, my thumbs shaking over the phone. I kept it simple and honest. I said, "Hi, Gia. This is going to sound insane, and I'm sorry to come into your life like this. A DNA test says we're half-sisters. I was raised believing I was adopted. But I've just found out that's not true. And I think your father may have been my biological father. I promise, I'm not looking for money or anything from your family. I'm pregnant, and I just want the truth for my own child." Did your dad ever know a woman named Carol? About 27 years ago? Then I put the phone face down on the nightstand and I stared at the ceiling, certain she'd never answer, certain I'd just thrown a grenade into a stranger's grief. She wrote back in 20 minutes. It was the middle of the night, and she wrote back in 20 minutes. Because as it turned out, she'd been staring at that same match on her own screen for 2 days, just as stunned as I was, trying to work up the courage to message me first. Her first message was just, "I've been hoping you'd reach out." I didn't know how to start. Yes, tell me everything. And that was the beginning of the strangest, most healing relationship of my life. Picture it, 2 grown women, strangers, in 2 different houses, in 2 different towns, both wide awake at 3 a.m, typing to each other with shaking hands, each holding one half of a secret neither of us had asked to inherit. She knew our father. I knew the woman who'd hidden me. Between the 2 of us, we had the whole truth, and we'd never have found it apart. There's a particular intimacy in that, in building the most important facts of your own existence with a person you've never met, fact by fact, late night by late night. By the end of that first week, Gia wasn't a stranger anymore. She was the first blood relative who had ever, in my whole life, been genuinely glad I existed. And over the next few weeks, Gia and I pieced it together, 2 strangers, 2 halves of a secret, building the truth between us, one late-night phone call at a time. We'd talk for hours, comparing notes like detectives working the same cold case from opposite ends. Her father, our father, was a man named Frank Russo. And Frank, Gia told me, had passed away 4 years earlier. A heart attack, fast, at 60. 4 years. I had a biological father, a real one, a man whose blood ran in me, and I had missed him by 4 years. 4 years. We had probably been in the same grocery stores, driven the same highways, lived our whole lives in the same handful of square miles, and I never knew to look for him. because someone had made very sure I wouldn't. I grieved a stranger that week harder than I have grieved almost anyone. I grieved the version of my life where I'd known him, where I'd had Sunday dinners with the Russos instead of auditioning for Glenn's leftover affection. Where I'd grown up knowing I belonged somewhere, to someone, fully, without an asterisk. They didn't just lie to me. They stole an entire father from me, and they ran out the clock, and now he was in the ground, and I would never, ever get to meet him. Gia sent me photographs, and here is the thing that broke me clean in half. I looked like him. I had spent 26 years searching every mirror for a face that matched mine. 26 years of being told I came from nowhere, and there he was. My nose. My chin. The same gap in the front teeth I'd been self-conscious about my whole life. That nobody else in the family that raised me had. For the first time in my existence, I looked at another human being and saw where I came from. I saw my own face looking back at me from a man I would never get to hug. And he was already gone. She told me about him too, which was its own kind of grief, because every good thing she said was a thing I never got. Frank coached Little League. Frank cried at movies. Frank was the guy who pulled over to help strangers change a tire. Frank, Gia said, would have lost his entire mind with joy to learn he had another daughter. He was that kind of man. The kind who collected people. Who never met a kid he didn't want to feed. The father I'd been denied wasn't cold like Glenn. He was the opposite of Glenn, and I had been handed Glenn, and told to be grateful, while the warm one drove around the next county over not knowing I was alive. From Gia, and from a couple of careful conversations with older relatives who were finally willing to talk now that it was all coming apart anyway, the full shape of it came clear. 27 years ago, my mother Carol and Frank Russo had an affair. It wasn't a one-night thing. It went on for the better part of a year, during a stretch when her marriage to Glenn was barely holding together. And then, Carol got pregnant. With me. She ended it. With Frank. She never told him she was pregnant, not then. Not ever. He went on to marry Maggie, to have Gia and her brother, to coach Little League and cry at movies and live a whole entire life, and he died never knowing he had another daughter out there, a paramedic in the next county over, with a granddaughter on the way he'd never get to meet. Carol made sure of that. She didn't just hide me from the world. She hid me from him. She erased Frank from my story so completely that he didn't even know there was a story, didn't know there was a little girl with his gap-toothed smile, growing up 20 minutes away, aching for exactly the kind of father he would have been. And she went back to Glenn. And here is where the lie was actually born. At a kitchen table, in a bargain between two adults who chose their own comfort over a child's truth. Glenn was humiliated and furious, but he was also unwilling to divorce, for all the reasons people of their generation stayed. The shame, the church, the talk, the money, the horror of being the couple people whispered about. So they struck a deal. They would stay married. They would raise the baby, but Glenn could not, would not, stand up in front of his family and his God and pretend this child was his own blood. So they reached for the kindest sounding lie they could find, the one that would cover everything at once. They told the family and the neighbors, and eventually me, that I was adopted. It was a perfect lie. If you only cared about the adults. It let Glenn play the nobleman who'd generously taken in a child. It made him a hero instead of a cuckold. It let Carol bury the affair where no one would ever dig. It explained, to a watching extended family, exactly why Glenn kept his adopted daughter at such a careful arm's length well. She's not really his, you know. Every cold thing he did to me, the lie made look reasonable. The adoption story wasn't built to protect me. It was built to protect them, from each other and from the world. And I was just the child who had to be raised inside it, in the cold, for 26 years, paying the bill for a debt I never ran up. I carried their secret in my own body for 26 years and called it my identity. Now let me tell you about the reckoning, and I'll tell you up front it didn't happen the way you might expect, the way these stories usually go. I didn't gather the whole family into a living room and dramatically announce the truth in front of everyone. I didn't fan out the Dina printouts on a table and make a speech while the relatives gasped. I thought about it, I'll admit. There's a version of me that wanted the audience, wanted them all to watch the lie collapse at once. But that's not what I needed, and it's not what the truth needed either. Public spectacle is for people who still want something from the room. I was done wanting anything from that room. What I needed was quieter and harder. I needed to look the people who had lied to me in the eye, one at a time, with no audience to perform for and nowhere to hide, and finally be the one in the room who knew more than they did. For 26 years, they had always known the one enormous thing I didn't. The whole architecture of my childhood ran on that imbalance. They had the truth, and I had the story they handed me. The reckoning wasn't about humiliating them. It was about ending that imbalance, in person, forever. So I went to them the way you approach anything you actually mean privately, directly, and without a script. I went to my mother first. Alone, I asked her to meet me at a diner neutral ground, a public booth, because I wasn't ready to do this in the house where it all happened, and because some animal part of me knew I needed to be somewhere I could stand up and leave. She came in smiling, no idea, sliding into the booth and asking about the pregnancy, asking if I'd been taking my vitamins, telling me I looked tired, and should I really still be working those shifts. I let her order coffee. I let her settle, and then I slid my phone across the table, open to my Dina results, to the line that said Gene Grandmother Biological, and I said, very quietly, Mom, I took a Dina test. For the baby. And I need you to look at it. I'm not adopted. I never was. Grandma is my biological grandmother. Mara is my biological cousin, which makes you my biological mother. So I think there's something you've been meaning to tell me for about 26 years. And here is what my mother did in that first moment, and it's the thing I'll never forget. The thing that told me everything about the last 26 years. She lied again. Her face did a flicker of pure animal panic. And then, watching me, she smoothed it right over. And she actually said, "Oh, honey, those tests, you can't trust those tests. They mix people up all the time, it's been in the news, they're not regulated. It's basically a toy." She was still lying. Sitting across from her grown, pregnant daughter, with the proof glowing on the table between us, and her very first instinct, before grief, before guilt, before anything human, was to reach for one more lie. 26 years of reflex. And I understood in that instant that if I had been weaker, if I had wanted to believe her even a little, she'd have done it again. She'd have talked me back into the dark, the way she always had. But I am not weak, and something in me had gone calm and cold and certain, the way it does on a bad call, when everyone else is screaming, and you realize you're the one who has to hold the line. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her and I said, "Stop. I've already talked to Gia Russo. I know about Frank. I've seen his picture, Mom. I have his nose. I have his gap in my teeth. I've grieved him already, a man I'll never meet, because you ran out the clock. So the lying is over. It died the day I found out he existed. The only thing you get to decide now is whether you tell me the truth in this booth, today, or whether I get up and walk out and you never meet your grandchild. Those are the options. Choose. And my mother broke. Not gracefully. She broke like a dam that had been straining for 26 years, and it all came pouring out. Ugly and fast, the affair, the pregnancy, the night she told Glenn, the bargain they struck at that same kitchen table I grew up eating breakfast at. She cried and she reached across for my hands, and she said, the thing that people like her always say, the thing that's supposed to fix everything, I did it to protect you, Sadie. I did it so you'd have a father. So you'd have a stable, home, a name, a roof. Everything I did for you. And I pulled my hands back, gently, but I pulled them back. Because I had heard a lifetime of being told that the cruelest things were done for my own good, and I was finally old enough and far enough out of that house to know the difference. I said, no, Mom, you didn't do it for me. If you'd done it for me, you would have given me the truth and trusted me to live with it. You did it for you. You made me carry your secret so you wouldn't have to. You let me believe I was unwanted, that I came from nowhere, that I had to earn every scrap of love in that house for 26 years, so that you would never once have to sit in a hard chair and say out loud what you did. You let Glenn treat me like a house guest in my own home. You let me lie awake hating myself, thinking there was something wrong with me, when the only thing wrong with me was that I was inconvenient proof. You let me grieve a phantom birth family that gave me up, when the woman who gave me up was sitting right across the table passing the potatoes. And you let my real father go to his grave without ever knowing I existed. That is not protection. That is a prison. And the cruelest part is, you made me build it myself, brick by brick, and say thank you for the walls. She didn't have an answer for that. There isn't one. Then I went to Glenn. And that conversation was shorter, and in some ways it hurt worse, because Glenn didn't cry, and didn't reach for my hands, and didn't pretend, even now, to feel something he never felt. I found him in the garage, where he'd always retreated from me, and I told him I knew everything, the affair, Frank, all of it. And this man, who had withheld himself from me for 26 years, didn't flinch and didn't apologize. He set down whatever was in his hands, and he looked at me with something that was almost relief. The relief of a man who's finally allowed to stop pretending. And he said, then you understand now why I couldn't. Why I couldn't. As if a baby, an actual infant, a child who did not choose to be born, who did nothing to anyone, had wronged him. As if I had committed a crime against him by simply existing. And I stood there in that cold garage, and I finally understood the whole architecture of my childhood. Glenn had spent 26 years punishing a little girl for a betrayal she had no part in. Every closed door, every flowers for Bree and nothing for me, every that's nice. Sadie, that wasn't coldness. It was revenge. He'd been getting back at Carol, and at Frank, by withholding love from the one person small enough to absorb it. He took his wife's affair out on a child for a quarter of a century, and he wasn't sorry. He was never going to be sorry. Because in the story Glenn told himself, he was the wronged hero who'd nobly raised another man's daughter. And I was the living insult he'd had to endure. I want to tell you I screamed at him. I didn't. I looked at this small, bitter man, and for the first time in my life I didn't feel 1 ounce of the desperate need for his approval. that had run my whole childhood. It had just evaporated. There was nothing there to chase anymore. So, I said the only thing worth saying. I told Glenn that I forgave him. Not because he'd earned it, he hadn't. And he never asked for it. I forgave him because I was about to be somebody's mother, and I was not going to carry his poison across the threshold of my child's life. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't a gift you give the person who hurt you. It's a thing you do for yourself, so you can finally put down the weight. And then I walked out of that garage, and I have not auditioned for that man's love one single day since. The silence where his approval used to live is the most peaceful silence I have ever known. Here is how it changed 3 families. Because it changed all of them. And I want you to see each one. It changed the family that raised me. And not in the way they'd feared all those years. The lie didn't protect them anymore, it couldn't. The truth came out to the whole extended family. Because secrets that big don't fit back in the box once they're open. I didn't have to expose anyone. I didn't make a single speech. I just stopped keeping their secret. And a secret that only survives because the victim agrees to hold it doesn't survive very long once she sets it down. And all of them, the aunts, the cousins, the grandparents, had to reckon with what Carol and Glenn had done. Not to a stranger's child, to one of their own, in plain sight. For a quarter of a century, while everyone clucked about how generous Glenn was to raise an adopted girl, Glenn's noble adoptive father reputation, the very thing he'd hidden behind, turned to ash in a single season. My mother had to live, finally, as the woman who actually did it, instead of the long-suffering saint she'd played at every holiday dinner. The image they'd traded my whole childhood to protect was gone, and they'd spent it all on nothing. And my sister Bree had the hardest reckoning of all, and I didn't even have to hand it to her. She got there herself, because Bree had to look at her entire childhood and understand that the crown she'd worn, the real daughter crown, the better seat at every table, had been sitting on top of her sister's stolen identity the whole time. She called me months later, crying so hard she could barely talk. And she said, "I think I always knew something was wrong with how they treated you, and I just took the better seat anyway. I let them do it to you because it was good for me." That was the truest, bravest thing anyone in that family ever said to me. It's the kind of honesty I'd waited my whole life to hear in that house. We're rebuilding, she and I, slowly, carefully, on honest ground, and honest ground, I've learned, is the only ground anything real can grow in. She's my sister. She always was. We just finally get to be sisters, without the lie standing between us. It changed the Russos, the family I never knew I had. Frank's widow, Maggie, was gracious in a way I had no right to expect. Think about what I was to her, living proof that her late husband, the man she was still grieving, had had an affair before she ever met him. The existence of me was an old wound she didn't ask to have reopened, and she could have slammed every door in my face, and I would have understood. Instead, she asked to meet me. And when I walked in, she looked at my face, Frank's face, his nose, his chin, that gap in the teeth, and this widow I'd never met put her hand over her mouth and wept. And then she crossed the room and hugged me, a stranger, and she said, "He would have loved you. Oh, honey, he would have lost his mind. He would have driven straight to your door the second he knew." She chose grace over grievance. She chose to see a daughter where she could have seen a betrayal. I will never stop being humbled by that. Gia became my sister in the truest sense of the word, the sister I'd never had. The one with no asterisk, the one who wanted me on day one without my having to earn a thing. Her brother came around slower, warrior, And honestly, that's fair. Not everyone has to be ready at the same speed, and a secret sibling is a lot to swallow. But I have a family now that shares my blood and my gap-toothed smile, and my way of crying at commercials. A family that claimed me without making me audition for the part. At Frank's grave, Gia and I planted a little rose bush together one Saturday, and I crouched down in the grass and I talked to a father I'll never get to meet. I told him I was sorry I was late. I told him I had his face and his daughter's love, and a baby of my own coming. I told him I'd found my way home, just 26 years and 4 years too late, and I swear the wind moved through that cemetery like an answer. And it changed the third family mine, the one I'm building. Because my daughter was born that spring, in the middle of all of it, and when they laid her on my chest, I did the thing I'd done my whole life. I searched her tiny face for the resemblances, for where she came from. Except this time, for the first time in my entire existence, I already knew. I knew exactly where she came from. I knew every branch of it, the beautiful and the broken. And I felt something I had never once felt growing up in that tidy brick house. I felt certain. She is mine, completely, with no footnote, no audition, no lie wrapped around her like a coat she'll never be allowed to take off. She is going to grow up knowing precisely who she is and where she comes from, all of it. The affair and the grief and the grace and the gap-toothed grandfather she'll only know from photographs. Because the one inheritance I will never ever hand my daughter is a secret. The thing in my family that breaks people, it broke on me. It stops here. It stops with me. So here's what I learned. Sitting in an ambulance bay with my whole life turned upside down on a 4-inch screen. A lie about who you are is the cruelest theft there is. Because it doesn't steal your things. It steals you. A thief who takes your money takes something you can earn back. A thief who takes your story takes the one thing you can never replace, the ground you stand on, to be a person at all. For 26 years, I believed the problem was me. That I was the unwanted one, the returned one, the child who had to be grateful for a home because she didn't really have a right to one. I built my entire self on that foundation, every choice, every fear. Every time I made myself small and useful so no one would have a reason to send me back. And the foundation was a lie. The whole house of me was built on a lie that other people poured to save themselves. I was never the unwanted one. I was the wanted one. Hidden. I was my mother's own daughter, with my mother's own grandmother's chin, and my real father would have driven straight to my door the moment he knew I drew breath. The not belonging I felt every single day of my childhood was never, ever a verdict on my worth. It was just the shape of somebody else's secret, pressing down on a child too small to know she wasn't the thing that was wrong. And if you grew up feeling like the footnote, like the one who didn't quite fit, the one who had to earn a love that came free to everyone else in the room, I need you to hear this. Because I would have given anything for someone to tell me. That feeling might not be the truth about you. It might be the shape of a lie you were handed too young to question. The coldness you absorbed, the certainty that you were less, that you were too much, that you didn't belong, that may have been somebody else's fear, somebody else's shame, somebody else's guilt, and you were simply the child small enough to fit underneath it and absorb it. It was never proof of anything wrong with you. It was proof of something wrong with them. You have a right to your own story, the real one, even when it's buried. Even when it costs you the people who buried it. The truth is the only ground you can stand on without sinking, and you are allowed to go and dig it up. With your own 2 hands, no matter how long they told you to leave it alone. I found out I wasn't adopted. But the deeper thing I found out, the thing I'd trade the rest for, is that I was never the stray they let me believe I was. I was wanted all along. I just had to spit in a tube, blow up 3 families, and grieve a father I never met, to finally, at 26 years old, come home to myself. And the strangest part, the part I never could have guessed, is that the truth gave me more than it took. It cost me a comfortable lie and 2 parents who only ever loved me in the shape of their own convenience. But it gave me a sister, a whole second family, my own face in a photograph, and for the first time in my life, solid ground under my feet. That's not a bad trade. That's the best trade I ever made. Thank you for sitting with me through all of it. If this reminded you of someone a person made to feel like an outsider in their own family, or anyone carrying a secret that was never theirs, to share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, have you ever found out that the story you were told about yourself wasn't the true one? I read every single one. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.